Shadows do not simply fall over the Blackwood Ridge, they suffocate. For decades, the locals whispered of a beast haunting the fog-choked timber, a feral monstrosity demanding tribute. But the truth hidden within the Lockwood Pack was far more insidious. They didn't feed a monster, they imprisoned a king. In the municipal records of Oak Haven, Washington, the disappearance of 22-year-old Audrey Fitzgerald was logged as a tragic hiking accident. Detective Arthur Penhaligon, a human investigator who spent months obsessing over the case, noted in his private journals that the terrain was too rugged, the weather too severe, and Audrey's limp, a lingering injury from a childhood fall, made her an unlikely candidate for a midnight trek. But human records rarely reflect the savage reality of pack law. Audrey did not wander into the Blackwood Ridge by choice. She was dragged. The Lockwood Pack was dying. For 5 years, a strange blight had poisoned their territory. The winter wheat rotted in the soil, the local game grew scarce. And worse, no children had been born to the pack since the last harvest moon. Panic breeds cruelty, and the pack's leader, Alpha Grayson Lockwood, needed a scapegoat to quell the rising terror of his people. He also needed to appease the ancient, terrifying presence that roamed the restricted northern boundary, a creature the elders simply called the Cursed Wolf. Audrey was the perfect casualty. Orphaned at a young age and relegated to the role of the pack's archivist, she lived on the fringes of their society. She spent her days cataloguing the pack's history in the damp basement of the community library, ignored by the elite and pitied by the rest. Her only confidant was Samantha Reyes, a local nurse who had tried, and failed, to petition the Alpha for Audrey's safety. On a bitterly cold Tuesday in late November, the decree was handed down. Beatrice Hale, the eldest of the council, stood before the gathered pack and proclaimed that the land was tainted by sin, and only a sacrifice of the innocent could cleanse the soil and pacify the beast of the ridge. The night they came for her, the freezing rain felt like needles against her skin. 2 enforcers hauled Audrey from her small cabin, her desperate pleas swallowed by the howling wind. They marched her 3 miles up the treacherous incline of the ridge, deep into the heart of the old-growth forest, where the pines grew so thick they choked out the moonlight. Grayson Lockwood waited at the boundary line, flanked by his highest-ranking guards. He was a tall, imposing man, his handsome features marred by a perpetual sneer of arrogance. "You should feel honored, Audrey," Grayson said, his voice a smooth, venomous drawl over the roar of the wind. "Your life will ensure the survival of your pack. It is the greatest service a wolf of your standing could ever hope to provide." "This is murder, Grayson," Audrey choked out, her knees sinking into the freezing mud. "You're feeding me to a feral animal because you can't figure out how to lead." Grayson's eyes flashed a dangerous, predatory yellow. He stepped forward, grabbing her jaw with punishing force. "I am the Alpha, and you are a liability. Tie her to the ironwood." They dragged her to a massive, dead tree that marked the edge of the forbidden zone. Using thick, heavy ropes laced with just enough wolfsbane to burn her skin and prevent her from shifting, they bound her to the trunk. The coarse fibers bit into her wrists and waist. She thrashed, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps, but the knots held firm. "May the ancestors have mercy on your soul," Beatrice Hale murmured, refusing to meet Audrey's eyes as she turned away. Grayson offered no such parting words. He simply turned his back, signaling his men to retreat. Within minutes, the glow of their flashlights disappeared down the mountain, leaving Audrey entirely alone in the suffocating dark. The cold was absolute, seeping through her thin wool coat and settling deep into her bones. She pulled violently against the ropes, ignoring the searing burn of the wolfsbane until her wrists were raw and weeping. It was useless. She was trapped. Hours bled into one another. The initial adrenaline faded, replaced by a numb, creeping lethargy. The forest around her was unnervingly silent. The usual nighttime chorus of owls and insects was entirely absent, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then she heard it. It started as a low, deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The scent hit her a second later. Petrichor, sharp pine, and the overwhelming, terrifying musk of a predator at the top of the food chain. A branch snapped to her left, the sound cracking like a gunshot in the still air. Audrey squeezed her eyes shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Make it fast," she prayed to whatever gods still listened to dying wolves. "Please just make it fast." A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the air, so deep it rattled her teeth. Slowly, Audrey opened her eyes. Emerging from the impenetrable shadows of the tree line was a monster. It was a wolf, but impossibly large, easily standing at shoulder height to a full-grown man. Its fur was midnight black, matted with mud and debris. But what drew Audrey's horrified gaze were the rusted, silver-plated chains deeply embedded in the creature's flesh. The heavy links crisscrossed over its massive chest and disappeared into the thick fur of its neck, a barbaric harness that had clearly been worn for years. The silver was constantly burning the beast, leaving jagged, weeping scars. But it was the creature's eyes that made Audrey's breath catch in her throat. They were not the cloudy, mindless eyes of a feral animal. They were a piercing, luminescent gold. They were sharp, they were intelligent, and as they locked onto her, they were filled with a profound, agonizing rage. The beast took a slow, deliberate step forward, its massive paws sinking soundlessly into the wet earth. Audrey pressed herself as flat against the ironwood trunk as she could, trembling violently. The sheer aura radiating from the wolf was suffocating, an overwhelming wave of dominance that forced her inner wolf into absolute submission. It didn't leap. It didn't bare its fangs in a blind frenzy. Instead, it stalked toward her with a terrifying, calculated grace, the heavy silver chains clinking softly with every movement. When it was close enough that Audrey could feel the heat radiating from its massive body, it stopped. The wolf leaned in, its giant muzzle inches from her face, inhaling her scent. Audrey squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping and tracking down her freezing cheek. She braced for the tearing of flesh, for the agony of the final bite. Instead, a profound, jagged groan echoed in her mind. Not a physical sound, but a psychic intrusion so powerful it made her gasp. "Why do they send me a broken thing?" The voice in her head was deep, masculine, and rough, like stones grinding against one another. It was heavily accented with pain. Audrey's eyes snapped open. The beast was staring intently at the ropes binding her, specifically at the places where the wolfsbane was burning her skin. The golden eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a fleeting second, the terrifying predator vanished, replaced by a look of weary comprehension. The wolf raised a massive paw, its claws extending like curved daggers. Audrey flinched, but the claws bypassed her entirely, hooking flawlessly under the thick ropes binding her chest. With a single, effortless jerk, the beast shredded the thick fibers. The ropes snapped, falling away into the mud. Audrey collapsed forward, her frozen legs unable to support her weight. Before she could hit the ground, the giant wolf shifted its body, allowing her to fall against its side. The fur was coarse, but the heat emanating from the beast was overwhelming, shocking her freezing system. The wolf stepped back, letting her sink to the wet forest floor. It let out another low, rattling growl, its massive body shuddering violently. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the clearing, a sickening, wet noise that made Audrey gag. The beast was shifting. She watched in horrified fascination as the monstrous wolf contorted. The transformation was not the fluid, seamless shift of a healthy werewolf. It was an agony. The silver chains embedded in its flesh tore and pulled as the body shrank and reshaped itself, the metal burning the skin as it transitioned from fur to bare human flesh. When the gruesome symphony of breaking bones finally ceased, a man knelt in the mud before her. He was breathing heavily, his broad shoulders heaving with the effort. He was completely nude, his body heavily muscled, but brutally scarred. The silver chains were still there, now wrapped tightly around his human chest and throat, digging into his pale skin. Dark, shaggy hair fell into his face, obscuring his features as he stared at the ground, waiting for the pain of the transition to subside. When he finally lifted his head, Audrey felt the air knocked from her lungs. Even through the dirt and the haggard, gaunt structure of his face, the aristocratic bone structure was undeniable. He possessed a harsh, breathtaking beauty, weathered by years of unimaginable suffering. But those eyes, those striking, luminescent gold eyes, were exactly the same. Audrey's mind raced. As the Pax archivist, she had spent years staring at old photographs and reading suppressed documents that Grayson Lockwood had tried to scrub from the municipal records. She knew the faces of the region's history. "Dominic," she whispered, the name tumbling from her lips before she could stop it. "Dominic Sterling?" The man went entirely still. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Slowly he pushed himself up to a crouch, his golden eyes narrowing into a lethal glare. "It has been a decade." His voice was a harsh rasp, ruined from years of disuse, since I heard that name. Audrey pushed herself backward, scrambling away until her back hit the ironwood tree. Dominic Sterling was not a myth. He was not a feral monster. He was the Alpha King of the Western Territories. 10 years ago, the official Pack history claimed he had gone mad with power, slaughtering his own guard before fleeing into the wilderness, never to be seen again. The Lockwood family had stepped up to take control of the region in the aftermath, positioning themselves as the saviors of the territory. "They said you were dead," Audrey breathed, her mind struggling to reconcile the history books with the scarred man bleeding in the mud. "They said you succumbed to the madness." A dark, bitter laugh escaped Dominic's lips. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the rusted silver collar tightly locked around his throat. "Madness? Is that what Grayson calls it?" He stood up, towering over her. Despite his nakedness and his scars, he moved with the undeniable, terrifying grace of a sovereign. He took a step toward her, and Audrey instinctively cowered. Dominic paused, his expression softening just a fraction. He reached down, grasping the edges of a discarded, rotting tarp left behind by hikers, and wrapped it around his waist. "I was not driven mad," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating frequency. "I was poisoned. Grayson's father, Marcus, and his loyal sycophants, including your precious elder Beatrice Hale, invited me to a summit to negotiate land borders. They laced the ceremonial wine with liquid silver and a paralyzing agent." Audrey listened, horrified. "While I was choking on my own blood," Dominic continued, his eyes burning with a decade of suppressed fury, "they bound me in these chains, forged with cursed silver, designed to lock me in my wolf form and slowly burn me from the inside out. They threw me into this ridge, knowing the agonizing pain would drive any wolf feral." He stepped closer, looming over her. "They didn't just steal my throne, little wolf. They stole my mind. For years I was nothing but a beast, driven by pain, hunting whatever crossed my path. It is only recently that the silver has rusted enough to allow me brief, excruciating moments of clarity. Brief moments to shift back." Audrey stared at the horrific scars crisscrossing his chest. The magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. The Lockwood Pack hadn't saved the territory. They had orchestrated a coup against their rightful king. And the blight, the sickness plaguing the Pack's lands, it wasn't a curse from a feral beast. "The land," Audrey whispered, realization dawning on her. The land is dying because it's rejecting a false alpha. It's tied to you. As long as you suffer, the territory suffers." Dominic looked at her, a spark of surprise flashing in his golden eyes. "You are observant for a sacrifice." "Who are you?" "Audrey," she said, her voice shaking but finding a sliver of courage. "Audrey Fitzgerald. I was the pack archivist." "Fitzgerald," Dominic mused, testing the name on his tongue. He stepped forward, offering a large, scarred hand to her. "Your parents were William and Nora. Good wolves, loyal to the crown. They died in a mysterious border skirmish shortly after I disappeared." Audrey's breath hitched. Grayson had always told her it was a rogue attack. Another lie. She looked at the massive hand offered to her, then up at the fierce, beautiful face of the deposed king. The pack had betrayed him. The pack had betrayed her. They were both victims of Grayson Lockwood's insatiable greed. Slowly, fighting the numbness in her limbs, Audrey reached out and placed her small, trembling hand into Dominic's. His grip was remarkably gentle as he pulled her to her feet. "They left you here to die, Audrey Fitzgerald," Dominic said softly, the rough edge of his voice carrying a dark promise. "They expected me to tear you apart, to bear the sin of your murder while they slept comfortably in stolen beds." He reached out, his thumb gently brushing the dirt from her bruised cheek. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core, awakening an instinct deeply buried within her wolf. "But Grayson Lockwood has made a fatal miscalculation," the Alpha King whispered, his eyes gleaming with the promise of vengeance. "He sent me a sacrifice, but he has given me an ally." Dominic turned his gaze down the mountain toward the distant, twinkling lights of Oakhaven. "It is time, I think, to remind my subjects who truly owns the Blackwood Ridge." Shelter was a rudimentary cave, hidden behind a cascading waterfall of freezing runoff, a secret haven Dominic had carved out during his rare, agonizing hours of human clarity. He carried Audrey the last half-mile, his massive, scarred frame practically immune to the biting cold. Her injured leg, exacerbated by the terrifying ordeal, had given out entirely. When he set her down on a bed of dried pine needles, the sheer intimacy of his proximity made her breath catch. "Drink," Dominic commanded, his voice a gravelly rumble. He handed her a battered tin canteen filled with rainwater. Audrey drank greedily, her hands trembling as she handed it back. In the dim light filtering through the cavern entrance, she could truly see the devastation wrought upon him. The rusted silver chains were thick, heavily inscribed with runic symbols that pulsed with a faint, sickening violet light. They crisscrossed his chest, biting into his flesh, but the primary locking mechanism sat heavy against his sternum, a solid block of cursed star metal. "Why haven't they killed you?" she asked softly, her archivist mind desperate to piece together the fragments of this horrifying puzzle. "If Grayson and his father wanted the throne, why leave you alive to suffer?" Dominic leaned against the cold stone wall, the tarp wrapped around his waist, doing little to hide the raw power of his physique. "Because an Alpha King's power is tied to the earth," he explained, his golden eyes heavy with exhaustion. "To kill me would shatter the territorial wards, leaving Oakhaven vulnerable to rival packs. So they bound me. They siphoned my sovereign aura to legitimize their rule. But the land knows I am imprisoned. It weeps. That is why your crops fail, Audrey. That is why no children are born. The territory is grieving its king." Audrey's heart sank. The barrenness of the pack, the stillbirths that had driven the community to the brink of despair. It wasn't a punishment from the ancestors. It was a direct result of Grayson's treason. "The lock," Audrey said, gesturing toward his chest, her fear entirely replaced by a cold, searing anger. "It looks like the ceremonial seal of the High Council, the only thing capable of breaking star metal is..." The ancestral dagger, Dominic finished, a bitter smile playing on his lips. Forged from the same meteor, Grayson keeps it locked in the Oakhaven Heritage Center, displayed like a trophy of his divine right to rule. Tomorrow is the Winter Solstice Gala, Audrey realized, her pulse quickening. Grayson is hosting the entire town at the Heritage Center to celebrate my successful sacrifice. He'll declare the woods cleansed. The dagger will be on the main stage. It's the centerpiece of the solstice ritual. Dominic's gaze sharpened, the feral predator within him rising to the surface. Then tomorrow night, we attend a gala. The descent into Oakhaven took hours. Under the cover of heavy snowfall, they navigated the treacherous deer trails until they reached the edge of town. Audrey led him to the rear entrance of the Cedar Valley Clinic, praying her only friend was on the night shift. Nurse Samantha Reyes nearly dropped her clipboard when she opened the loading dock door. She stared in absolute horror at Audrey, covered in mud and rope burns, and then at the towering, half-naked, scarred man looming defensively behind her. "Audrey?" Samantha choked out, pulling her inside the sterile hallway and locking the door. "They said, Grayson announced you were taken by the beast. He gave a eulogy 3 hours ago." "Grayson is a liar, Sam," Audrey said fiercely. She grabbed a set of scrubs from a nearby laundry cart and handed them to Dominic. "This is Dominic Sterling, the true alpha." Samantha's knees buckled. As a born wolf, the sheer, suffocating weight of Dominic's aura, even suppressed by the silver, was undeniable. She fell into a subservient crouch, her eyes wide with terror and reverence. "Get up," Dominic ordered gently, pulling the blue surgical scrubs over his massive frame. "I need your help, not your submission." In the sterile safety of the clinic's break room, they formulated a plan. Samantha provided them with the security blueprints for the Heritage Center, confirming that Grayson had doubled the guard detail. More importantly, she confirmed a horrific rumor. Beatrice Hale, the elder who had orchestrated Audrey's sacrifice, was planning a blood-binding ritual at the gala to permanently sever Dominic's connection to the land, transferring the last of his royal aura directly into Grayson. "If she completes the ritual," Dominic said, his jaw tightening, "I will die. And Oakhaven will fall into permanent ruin." "We won't let her," Audrey promised. She looked up, her brown eyes meeting his luminescent gold. The connection that passed between them was electric, a silent vow forged in the crucible of their shared betrayal. Dominic reached out, his knuckles brushing against her cheek in a fleeting, tender caress that sent a shiver down her spine. He was a weapon, forged in agony, but in her presence, he was entirely human. The Oakhaven Heritage Center was a sprawling stone facade building that usually served as a museum for the town's founding history. Tonight, it was a fortress of extravagance. High-end SUVs lined the snow-covered driveway, and the elite of the Lockwood Pack mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, dressed in their finest silk and tailored suits. In the subterranean utility tunnels beneath the building, Audrey and Dominic moved like ghosts. Audrey's years in the archives had given her intimate knowledge of the town's forgotten Prohibition-era bootlegging routes. She led him through the damp, narrow corridors until they stood directly beneath the floorboards of the main exhibition hall. Above them, Grayson Lockwood's voice echoed through the ventilation grates, amplified by a microphone. "Tonight we close a dark chapter in our history," Grayson proclaimed, drawing thunderous applause from the sycophants in the crowd. "The Blackwood Ridge is purified. The beast has been satiated. We look forward to a new era of prosperity, an era where the Lockwood name guides us into the light." "Now," Dominic whispered in the dark, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. Audrey kicked the rusted latch of the service grate. It gave way with a screech of protesting metal. The crowd in the exhibition hall gasped as the heavy iron grate near the stage burst open. Two enforcers, Bennett and Hayes rushed forward, but they were thrown aside like rag dolls as Dominic pulled himself up onto the polished hardwood floor. Audrey scrambled up right behind him. The music stopped abruptly. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the sudden, suffocating pressure of an alpha's fury. Dominic stood to his full height, the ill-fitting medical scrubs doing nothing to diminish the terrifying majesty of his presence. His golden eyes locked onto Grayson, who was standing at the podium, his face draining of all colour. To Grayson's right stood Beatrice Hale, clutching an ancient leather-bound grimoire, and resting on a velvet pillow between them was the ancestral dagger. "Grayson Lockwood," Dominic's voice boomed, echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. It wasn't just a voice. It was a command that forced half the wolves in the room to involuntarily drop to their knees. "You are sitting in my chair." Chaos erupted. Grayson's personal guard rushed the stage, but the hesitation in their movements was obvious. They recognized the aura. They recognized their king. "Kill him!" Grayson shrieked, his polished veneer shattering into cowardly panic. "He's a rogue. Kill him now!" 3 guards lunged. Dominic moved with blinding speed. Despite the heavy silver chains restricting his chest and burning his skin, his combat prowess was unmatched. He caught the first guard by the throat, slamming him into the stage, and kicked the second one backward into a catering table. He didn't use lethal force. These were his people, manipulated by a usurper. Using the distraction, Audrey sprinted toward the stage. Beatrice Hale saw her coming and raised her hand, her eyes glowing with dark magic, ready to strike the girl down. "You discarded me, Beatrice!" Audrey yelled, launching herself forward. She tackled the frail, corrupt elder to the ground, knocking the grimoire from her hands. Grayson, realizing his guards were failing, shifted. His bones cracked as he transformed into a massive, sandy-brown wolf. He lunged at Dominic, aiming for his throat. The impact sent them both crashing into the museum displays, shattering glass and splintering wood. Dominic, trapped in his human form by the cursed silver, fought back with brutal, primal strength. He caught Grayson's snapping jaws, his muscles straining against the immense weight of the wolf. The silver chains glowed a violent violet, burning deeper into Dominic's flesh as he used his strength, his agonized roars mixing with Grayson's feral snarls. "Audrey!" Dominic roared, his voice thick with pain. "The blade!" Audrey scrambled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in her bad leg. She darted to the podium, snatching the heavy star-metal dagger from its velvet pillow. The blade practically hummed in her hand. She turned and ran toward the struggling pair. Grayson saw her approach and threw his massive weight, pinning Dominic to the floor and snapping viciously at his face. Audrey didn't hesitate. She threw herself onto her knees beside them, raised the ancestral dagger high, and drove it downward with every ounce of strength she possessed. She didn't strike Grayson. She struck the heavy, runic lock resting against Dominic's sternum. The collision of star metal against cursed silver produced an explosive shockwave of blinding blue light. The sound was deafening, like a thunderclap detonating inside the room. The shockwave threw Grayson off Dominic, sending the false alpha crashing into the far wall. The windows of the Heritage Center shattered instantly, raining glass down on the screaming crowd. The thick, rusted chains binding Dominic's chest shattered into thousands of harmless, smoking fragments. For a second, the room was perfectly still. Then, the true power of the Alpha King was unleashed. Without the silver to suppress him, Dominic's aura exploded outward. It was a tangible, physical force that swept through Oakhaven like a hurricane. Every single wolf in the room, including the guards and the elite, was instantly driven to the floor, their faces pressed against the hardwood in absolute, uncontrollable submission to their sovereign. Dominic stood up. The wounds on his chest were already beginning to knit together, sealing with unnatural speed. His golden eyes burned like miniature suns. He looked down at Grayson, who was whimpering on the floor, trapped in his human form by the sheer, crushing weight of Dominic's dominance. Your reign of rot is over, Grayson, Dominic stated, his voice devoid of mercy. You are stripped of your rank, your name, and your right to run in these woods. You will face the justice of the council you corrupted. Dominic turned away from the whimpering usurper and extended his hand to Audrey. She was breathing heavily, the ancestral dagger still gripped loosely in her fingers. She looked at the king, no longer a beast, no longer a prisoner, but a ruler in all his terrifying glory. He didn't demand her submission. He waited. Audrey smiled, tears of relief pricking her eyes, and placed her hand in his. He pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping a protective arm around her waist, and turned to face his kneeling pack. The winds over Blackwood Ridge no longer howled with the agony of a betrayed king. Oakhaven's records reflect a necessary correction in municipal history. Audrey Fitzgerald, once a discarded archivist, now stands firmly beside Dominic Sterling. Together, they rule a healing land. The shadows have finally lifted, proving that even the most broken spirits can forge a sovereign future from the ashes of betrayal and reclaim their rightful, hard-won crown.